Welcome to Psych Sessions at Work, where we talk about jobs with the people who study jobs. I'm your host, Janet Peters. Each episode in this series features work psychologists that share what it means to be an industrial organizational psychologist, the type of work they do, and reflections from their own career paths. I'm excited to share these insights with you, so let's get to work. Okay, on today's show, we have Dr. Christy Panico, who works at Amazon as a senior research scientist. Hi, Christy. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Janet. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to have you on the show. I have a million questions that I want to ask you. And I think what I'm going to start with first is tell us a little. So you work at Amazon. You are a senior research scientist. Can you tell, what is that? That seems like a fairly broad title for an IO psychologist to have. What does that look like for you?
Sure. Yeah, that role does vary a lot across Amazon. My role specifically is focused on, I'm in an embedded diversity, equity, and inclusion team. So my research and my focus is on predominantly inspecting talent processes and employee experience to ensure that everyone's having an equitable experience, with an emphasis on ensuring marginalized communities, their voices are heard and they're represented in what we're doing and the data that we're looking at.
How long have you been in that role?
I've been in this role about 3 years now.
So then what does a typical day look like for you? Are you in meetings? Are you traveling? Are you working one-on-one? Are you working with groups? How are you a project manager? What kind of work are you doing there?
Yeah. Typical day, there is a lot of meetings. Amazon's a matrix organization. So I kind of have two teams. I'm embedded within a team of diversity practitioners. So I'm the only researcher on that team. And then I kind of have a dotted line to a team of researchers that are working on other HR research projects, not necessarily related to diversity. So I have a lot of meetings. I also meet a lot with cross-functional partners, so HR leaders or talent management leaders, researchers across other parts of the company I meet with a lot. And then I do have a lot of one-on-ones. So I have a number of people that I mentor, both within and external to Amazon. And then I try to carve out time to do the work. So to do the research, to get into the data. And then at Amazon, we have a really unique culture where most of our deliverables are documents. So we deliver pretty much everything in a document. PowerPoints are non-existent pretty much at Amazon. So I do a lot of writing.
Really?
That's kind of a typical day.
So can you tell me a little bit about the documents over PowerPoints? Is it so that they're available in perpetuity? Is that just the preferred mode of communication and documenting? And I have a secondary question is, can you tell the audience a little bit about what a matrix organization is or the way that you're using that term?
Sure. So I'll start with a matrix question. So by matrix, I mean organizations where they're not necessarily purely hierarchical, in the sense that the reporting structure doesn't always actually represent who your stakeholders are and who you're accountable to. So in my case, I have my reporting structure and my direct line of management, but actually most of my deliverables are going to other people, to other teams. And so it's kind of that dotted line of I officially report this way, but I have a lot of unofficial kind of managers or supervisor, senior leaders that I'm accountable to. And then what was the first part of that question?
It was about the you said no PowerPoints, which is just kind of surprising for me to hear. A lot of the folks that I've been interviewing have talked about a lot of the deliverables are through PowerPoint. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, it's super unique to Amazon, and I actually love it. I think it's a thing that people either love or hate here. I am on the camp of loving it. The idea behind it, it starts with Bezos himself. It's kind of been this way, from what I understand, the entire Amazon tenure. The idea is that, to write a document, we refer to them as one-pagers. So one-pager is like quick document you need to get out to someone, or six-pager is kind of the longest document we'll write. But then there's often many, many appendices to those six-pagers. And the idea is that you really have to flesh your idea out a lot more to put it in writing. So to develop an entire doc, you have to think through a lot more about the idea and have it kind of more fully formed to be able to put it in that format. And then the other really unique thing about it is, even though we do everything in documents, there's never an expectation that people are pre-reading documents. So typically half of our meetings is spent reading documents. So rather than coming into a meeting and someone tells you about their idea, you come into a meeting, they drop a document into the video conferencing, and then you spend the first half of the meeting reading that document, and then the second half of the meeting discussing that document.
This is very interesting to me. And it is very interesting to me because I work with students, right? Because I'm a professor, and I think about when I'm having them create a piece of writing and this idea of creating it for the purpose of someone else to consume, where you can't necessarily expect that they're going to know. So you have to flesh out your idea well, right? But you have to provide that like balance of information of here's the context you need to know and putting the context in, but then also, not too much where it needs to be short. I want like that idea of a one pager. I'm pretty into that. That's really interesting. And you feel like it's effective for sharing ideas and sharing results of different things you're doing?
I do feel it's really effective for me. So I, like you, went to graduate school where we wrote a lot. So I will say that is a skill I have practiced a lot, and probably why I lean into that approach a little bit more. Whereas, it doesn't work for everyone. And so I think there is some balance there of the focus on the documents, but for me, I find it really effective.
Yeah, I like that. Which also just that unique approach, I think leads me to my next question, is because I know, I think it was your first job out of graduate school, but I can't quite remember. So you can refresh my memory there. Is before you were at Amazon, which is this huge, Fortune 10 company, I'd have to imagine, whatever it is, but it's very large company, very large reach. You started at this like tiny startup. Really at sort of its inception, and worked through there and got experience. And so I'm curious about the differences between this small startup that you worked for and working for a company as large as Amazon. And if you'll sort of share with the audience what the difference in experiences with the scope of that kind of work.
Yeah. It was never my intention to go from such extremes, but I really did go from like very extreme new company to a pretty established large corporation. So I'd say there's a lot of similarities and some differences that are pretty important to note. Maybe I'll start with the differences. I think the biggest difference for me in terms of my role is in a smaller company, in the startup, I was managing a lot of different functional areas. So I was managing research and development. I was managing internal talent management, internal selection, training, performance management. I was supporting sales. I was doing some client delivery. I had a huge variety of things that I was doing. And I was going pretty deep into each of those, but I was also able to get that exposure across, whereas at Amazon, that role would never be feasible in a 40-hour week, right? Like that, the job I had there would be hundreds of people at Amazon. So at Amazon, you're much more specialized. So you kind of have to pick which of those you want to do, and then you kind of focus more on that. So I would say that that's one of the big differences, is just like the breadth of exposure to different functional areas, as well as maybe the skills. The skills required at a startup, I think, are a little bit different than those at a corporation. I would say in the startup environment, being really flexible and learning on the go, and being willing to experiment and fail fast. Those are all things that we encourage at Amazon too, but it just looks very different. Let's see, let me think about some of the other, in terms of some of the differences, I would also say at the startup, the organizational culture was still forming, right? Like I was pretty instrumental in helping form what does that look like. I could have input into that. Whereas a company like Amazon, it's much more ingrained. It's going to be much more difficult to change. So you're more like you assimilate into that culture, or you leave if that doesn't fit for you. Whereas in a startup, I think there's more opportunity to kind of help influence what that culture is and fit it to something that might work better for you. What else? I would say the other main difference, and then I'll go to some of the similarities, is kind of just the talent processes. So in a startup, again, I think you have the ability to influence that. It's much more based on that unique employee experience because there's not many employees and they can do that.
How many employees were there when you started at that startup?
I was the second full-time employee.
Yeah. Okay. And it grew to a dozen or so while you were there before you moved to Amazon?
Yeah, probably more than that. Probably, yeah, somewhere.
Okay, so we're talking. There. You started small. You really got to shape that. Okay, all right, I'm with you.
Yep. Yeah, so that's good to caveat too, because all startups are not the same, of course. And I'm talking very small initial days of a startup, whereas there's startups that are certainly further along, and some of this might not apply as much. But I will say, so like the talent processes, like what does it look like to be hired? What does career progression look like? What does promotion look like? A lot of times in a startup, those things aren't well defined. You're kind of figuring them out as you go and helping the organization figure them out as they go. Whereas, of course, at Amazon, like those are very structured processes. And so it's, there's just a little bit more ambiguity on what that looks like as an employee, I think, in a startup compared to a larger corporation. Similarities, I would say both I found to be really important to be agile. So responding to the business needs or to the market needs and being able to pivot quickly. You would think Amazon with its size does not do that, but they do. A lot of people say Amazon's kind of like a company of 500 little startups or 500 smaller companies. And so it really does operate in that sense of being really agile and being able to respond quickly to what the business needs and market needs are. And then I would say in both, there's probably quite a bit of ambiguity. In the startup, it's, you're just doing things for the first time. You haven't done it before and you're building things from the ground up. Whereas in a corporation like Amazon, the ambiguity is more like, how do we scale? Like the size at which we're operating, at least for me, was very new. So it's like, how do we make that impact across, 1 million employees or whatever it may be? And then I would say with both, you're solving, at least for me, I was solving really hard problems. So again, at the startup, it was like starting from scratch. How do I build this from the ground up? Whereas at Amazon, it's how do I navigate the internal infrastructure, something you don't have to think about as a startup as much, and how do you kind of influence without authority, I think is a really important skill at a company like Amazon.
It's interesting. If you don't mind, I'm going to reflect on what I'm hearing you say, which is when I think about the skills of IO psychologists, I think one of the things that we do well is we take ambiguous problems and we solve them and we try and do it quickly. And I think those skills are difficult to explain or quantify what that necessarily looks like, right? To just say, well, people who are good in this role are people who can take there's no right answer. And for some people that makes them deeply uncomfortable of like, oh, it's not necessarily a math problem where you're going to compute something out and it's going to give you a perfect answer. It's messy because humans are messy and humans at work are messy. And so it sounds like, from both ends of the spectrum, there are these skills that help you deal with that, which is the ambiguity, which is awesome. And it means that I want to ask you one of my favorite questions to ask guests, which is, tell me about a project that you've worked on that you either it was interesting for you, or you felt like it was effective, or it benefited people, or just that you loved being part of, or enjoyed doing, or learned something from.
Sure. Yeah, probably one of my favorite projects so far in my career was at my last company at the startup. We were a virtual assessment center. And so we had a need for assessors that were, observing participants during these online simulations. And the scale at which we were growing, we needed to be able to hire these people very quickly, onboard them fairly quickly, and somewhat hands-off, because I was doing this a little bit independently there for a while. I had some help, but we were a lean company for sure. And so it was, how do we find these people? Because it's a very unique skill to be an assessor in an assessment center, right? The assessors, for those that aren't familiar, are observing people in online simulations, and then they're evaluating their behavior on a number of predetermined criteria or competencies, and they're evaluating the effectiveness of those behaviors in the context. And it's during what's called a day in the life simulation. So there's role plays, there's presentations the person's putting together. They're having a phone call with their direct report, or they're coaching a coworker on a problem that they're trying to solve. So you get a real opportunity to evaluate the person's ability to be effective in those situations and their skills and competencies. But of course, because human judgment and human decision making can be so individualized, we have to develop standardized ways of doing that. So part of my job was, okay, how do I bring on a lot of these assessors? First of all, where do I find them? Because most people don't have that background. It's a very unique background. So thinking about like, what are the skills that we need for this role, and what are transferable skills? So like, what are other skills that people might have, or other experiences that people might have that might lend itself to this role? Where do I find those people? How do we recruit them? And then how do we select them and train them at scale in ideally a hands-off way, while also ensuring the kind of integrity of the process. So making sure we're really maintaining a high hiring bar for that role. So that was what I was tasked with, and it was
oh yeah, that sounds
fun.
easy.
It actually, I mean, it certainly wasn't easy, but it was really fun to think through that. I failed a lot. There was a lot of things that didn't work out, and so we'd scrap them and pivot on what we were doing. But we eventually got to a point where we developed a good system. I was able to hire a team that then helped me build an entire learning management system. We developed a number of assessments to kind of do knowledge checks throughout the process, so that we could feel confident that the hands-off approach was still evaluating the candidates in the same way, and then the new hires in the same way. And we ended up developing a pretty extensive onboarding, training, and then certification program for those assessors that allowed us to hire quickly and hire at scale, and enabled us to hire, I don't even know how many we hired. I want to say 40 or more assessors and coaches from all over the world in multiple languages, multiple time zones, to be able to meet the global needs of that company at the time.
That's awesome. I have to, for those that are listening that don't quite know what assessment centers are, it's this idea of you're putting people through these simulations like Christy mentioned. And When I was learning about them in graduate school, I'm going to share this with you, Christy. When I was learning about them in graduate school, I thought those are never going to work. They're so bored, and they were boring. Like this is me being a graduate student who's like, oh, that's boring. That's not going to work. If you're putting people through like like you said, like having them do the simulation of a presentation or talking to an employee that they maybe have to give negative feedback or developmental feedback to, I thought, it's a simulation. They're going to be on their best behavior. You're not going to see any of these differences. And then I worked on a project where we did one, and we brought in people to do this leadership assessment. And they had to do what I mentioned, which was give developmental feedback to an employee who's underperforming. And I watched or assessed maybe 4 of them. And I thought, oh, this is why we do this as a psychologist, because I didn't expect to see a variety in behavior, but I really did. And I observed some very ineffective behaviors. And I thought, okay. And then they used the project we were working on was, I really liked, they used that for feedback to help them develop their leadership skills. It wasn't for the project I was working on. It wasn't to select them. It wasn't a selection thing. It was for developing and feedback and like, oh, here's some advice about handling this differently, or some strategies and techniques. But yeah, assessment centers, I can't imagine. So we did that on a small scale with a small organization. I can't imagine doing that with 40 assessors. So that's a cool project. I like it. Okay. Speaking of graduate school, one of the things that for those of you who haven't gone to graduate school and IO psychologists, one of the things you hear very frequently, it's like our mantra, is the science practice balance. And even for folks who go and they work for Amazon and for startups and for all of these companies, and they might not ever do research as we think about it in academia. They might not ever publish a paper, but you're still out there applying the science. And so I'm just curious, what does that look like for you in your job in terms of how do you stay fresh on the science, or how do you apply the science and making sure what you're doing conforms to best practices? What is that? What is this, especially you're a senior research scientist. What does that research part look like for you? Yeah.
So the research part for me looks similar to how you would see it in an academic organization. We develop hypotheses, we write a paper, we get support for that, and then we run experiments or, test those hypotheses. So like the actual research process, I would say looks fairly similar, although we don't lean on external research. I don't know if this is specific to Amazon. I've heard, I used to be a consultant, and I heard this from many other companies as well, that they like their research internal. So it's like, oh, well, does that apply to me? I'm not sure. There's always that, well, our company's different. So I would say that the main difference is probably, less reliance on external research, though it's still very much in forefront of my mind. It's still part of how I develop hypotheses or how I'm thinking about problems. I'm just not citing external research in the documents I'm writing to the same degree. But the research very much looks the same. The practitioner part of that, I would say is one thing that I have to have that in my role. For me, I have to be a scientist practitioner, and being in a scientist role, I think it's very easy to be a scientist without a practitioner. And so for me, what I've done to make sure I have that is keep my connection to the business. So as I mentioned, I'm in a team with diversity professionals, and that's super helpful because they are working one-on-one with their business leaders, and that the application, the business problems, the way that they use that data or that information is a critical part of what I do. And it's actually a really important part for me in terms of the meaningfulness of my work. Like without that application, I don't think I'd be in the role that I'm in. And then the other part where that application comes in is, of course, the impact. So in corporations, you're doing research to solve a problem, and there's some type of hopefully immediate or fairly short-term impact that you can make with the results of that research. So that's always the fun part for me when I get to kind of towards the end of a research project and I know what we're finding, and then I can start to think about, okay, what does this mean for the business problem that we're trying to solve? Like in application, does this mean we're changing a talent process? Does this mean we're supplementing something, a decision-making process? It always involves some kind of change or initiative or some kind of impact, which is what gets me most excited.
Yeah. So we're sort of sharing the things that you're doing now, right? And doing that science and balancing that science practice. I want to step back a little bit to how you got here. So can you tell us a little bit about what you majored in as an undergrad and how you got to where you are right now? Can you tell us a little bit about what that path looked like for you?
Sure. Yeah, my path was not linear. So in undergrad, I was a psychology major, and then I was pre-vet for a while. I thought I wanted to be a veterinarian. And then I took physics 2, and it was really hard. And I was like, I don't know about vet school. Like if there's a lot of physics involved, and come to find out there's not. So I was misinformed at the time that I made that decision. But nonetheless, I pivoted and was like, okay, maybe this isn't the track that I want to go. I was also doing some work in a residential treatment center for adolescents. And I found that work really meaningful and really important. So with the psychology undergrad, I was really torn between clinical psychology and IO psychology. I was fortunate to have exposure to both in undergrad. So I felt like I understood at least a little bit about both fields. I initially pursued clinical psychology. I did a master's in clinical before I decided that I wanted a little bit more direct application in terms of people's day-to-day life. And I found that in IO. So I found a lot of the concepts in clinical were applicable to IO, but with a much broader audience and the ability to make potentially, a broader impact, a greater impact on society and people and lives through the application of psychology at work. So after my master's in clinical, I pivoted and then decided to pursue the IO PhD. And en route, redid the master's, so did the IO master's in that process, and then finished there. And I would say, though it wasn't a linear path, and I don't know that I used like the coursework from my clinical degree as much. The skills of that program were incredibly valuable and remain valuable to me, and something that I use every day, probably.
Yeah, I feel simpatico with that. I had the same thing where I really liked the skill set. But I think for me, I knew earlier on, for me personally, I don't think counseling's for me. Like I like the skills, but not necessarily in that specific application. And so finding IO, I felt that same way as you. It was like, oh, here's these skill sets or skills that I think I'm good at, these skills that I enjoy, but they're in an application where I feel like I can have a big impact in reaching out to other people in the day in and day out. I mean, people are spending the vast majority of their lives at work. So I that is also, what sort of pulled me into IO. And we have time for sort of one last question, which is you as someone who is works with other folks, employees at a company like Amazon, or even a startup where you were part of selection and you were part of this idea of picking who is going to be the best person in this job or in this role. And a lot of the listeners, being undergraduate students, are going to be in the workforce, right? That's where they're headed, is in a few short years, is the workforce. So my question is knowing what you know about IO, about job selection, about all of those aspects of when people enter the workforce, what sort of advice do you have for them to maximize their market competitiveness or skills that they should have, or what you're looking for?
That's a really good question. Also a really tough question. So I'll do my best to answer it.
You can keep it simple if you want.
I will say, so this is my personal experience, volunteer or intern or do what you have to do to get some experience in the area you think you're interested in. And even if it's a little bit tangential, even if it doesn't seem directly what you want to be doing, even if it's unpaid, I would say go for it to get that experience, because there's no courses that are going to give you the representative view of what that career is going to look like. Like, I think back on my IO courses, not a single one really gave me that complete picture of what any of my roles have ever looked like. So I think gaining that experience, particularly as a new graduate, when you don't have a lot of work experience, having something, whether that's volunteer, whether that's a short-term project, or whether that's, a role that you took on some extra responsibilities for, I think is really helpful and really valuable. And along with that, I would say really thinking about what type of role you want to be in and talking to people that do it, talking to people that are in that role or have considered that role or worked in that role in the past, I think is really helpful. I know for me, when I was out of undergrad, I had like these ideas of what I wanted to do, and I had ideas of what I wanted my career to look like, but I didn't actually understand what those careers looked like in practice until I started doing them. And so I think getting as much exposure as you can is helpful. What else would I say? I would say it's spending a lot of time thinking about your transferable skills. So as from a selection component, that's where I'm coming at this one, is thinking about the experiences that you have had, whether they're paid or non-paid work or, what they can be community experiences, it doesn't matter. But thinking about the skills that you've gained or that you've shown in those experiences and how they might transfer into the roles that you're thinking about or the careers that you're applying for. Because I guarantee you there's way more transferable skills than you think there are. And your employer's not going to see that. A recruiter's not going to easily see that. I mean, really good recruiters will see that, but it's putting that work on the recruiter, whereas as a candidate, you can do that work for them, making that a lot easier to outline, here's the competencies of the role, and here's the skills that I bring based on the experiences that I've had. Let me think if there's anything else I would add to that. I took a few notes. I know you told me not to prepare, but of course I did.
That in no way surprises me about you, Christy. And it honestly, I find it absolutely delightful.
Okay, I had one more I wrote down. I'm glad I took notes. The last one I wrote down was really follow opportunities, like especially if they make you uncomfortable. Lean into those opportunities that you're like, I'm not skilled to do this. I'm not sure this is a good fit for me. I mean, less so on the fit, but lean into the opportunities that are presented to you, and particularly lean into things that help you grow and make you a little bit uncomfortable. I would say that's how I got where I am today. So when I look back at my career, I was a professor at the university. I had just signed a contract to teach. I was wrapping up my fall semester. I had already agreed to spring semester. I had already wrote the syllabus. My name was on the courses. Students were signed up, and I got offered the role at the startup that I knew wouldn't be there at the end of the semester. So I'm like, well, this is going to be a really tough semester to do both. But this just seems like too good of an opportunity to pass up. So I ended up doing both roles for a semester, and it paid off in the long term. I mean, the experience I had at that startup was so invaluable. And had I shied away from, the difficulty of navigating that situation, I think my career would look a lot different.
I adore that advice, because I think sometimes we forget that growth can be uncomfortable, right? If you're comfortable in it, kind of means you're not pushing, you're not growing, you're not changing. And I think, yeah, that place of discomfort can often be that source of growth. That is wonderful advice. Okay. We are at, I don't know, 33 minutes or so. Is there anything else about IO psychology or anything you've learned along the way or any last ideas you want to sort of shout out to the ether or share with us?
I would say for students considering IO psychology, definitely practice your elevator speech on what IO psychology is, because I think one of the questions potentially that we're going to be asked was, what's one of the biggest challenges of IO? And I really do think that's marketing ourselves and communicating the value, the skill set, and the expertise that we bring. It's a vast field. There's a lot that IO psychologists do, and IO psychologists are trained across a wide spectrum of areas. And I just don't know that there's common knowledge around that. I mean, even when I started at Amazon, which employs dozens, if not hundreds of IOs, I was surrounded by people that had no idea what IOs were. They had no idea what my skill set was. They didn't know what they could leverage me for. And so it was really all throughout my career, I've had to really educate people on this is what we do. This is what I can offer. And so I would say if students are considering pursuing IO, then get comfortable with explaining and marketing your skills.
But like, doesn't that harken back to your own advice to students? Is that like they don't? If someone doesn't know what IO is, you have to tell them. Like and someone might look it up or might figure it out, but like it's our job to tell them, here's what we know, here's our skills, here's the way that you can leverage our knowledge, which is vast and applied. But like it goes back to like the literal advice you gave of know how to communicate what you can do and be able to say, here are the skills that I have. Okay, well, that we are so over time, but because it was so fun to talk to you. So, Dr. Christy Panico, Amazon, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's been such a pleasure to chat with you, and I hope this was helpful.
Thank you.